Thousands of visitors come to Hereford Cathedral each year to wonder at one of the world's greatest medieval works, the fascinating Mappa Mundi. But a visit offers another unique historical treasure, the Chained Library. Here, 229 medieval manuscripts are preserved, including the 8th century Hereford Gospel, as well as books from later centuries, each chained for security to the library shelves as they were in the 17th century. While such libraries previously existed throughout Europe, only the Hereford Library has survived with all its chains intact. The cathedral's librarian, Dr. Rosemary Firman, takes us on a tour and tells its story.
The Chained Library at Hereford Cathedral is the only library of its type in which all the books are still chained to the shelves. At the time it was constructed, in the early 17th century, it would have been admired for being bang up to date, following the style of the new bookcases installed in Duke Humphrey's library at Oxford University. It enabled many readers to study simultaneously, whilst keeping the valuable books secure. Many of the books in the Chained Library are much older than the shelves themselves. It contains the remains of an important medieval library, and to trace its full story, we must travel back over more than 1,000 years. The oldest book in the library is the Hereford Gospels, which dates from around the year 800 and is known to have been a renowned possession of the cathedral before the Norman Conquest. It contains the 4 Gospels in Latin and was probably made in Wales or Western England. It is possible that it is the oldest surviving book to have been produced in Wales. The Hereford Gospels is also the oldest surviving artefact at the cathedral, older even than any of the stonework. At this early period, there is no evidence of any library being at the cathedral. The Norman Conquest of 1066 led to huge changes. Within a few years, office holders in both church and state were replaced by men supporting the new regime, many of them Normans, and the energy and zeal and experience which they brought with them resulted in the development of cathedrals as centres of learning, and in parallel with that, places where books were required. This book, one of just 6 or 7 books in the library today which date from before the 12th century, is one of the earliest surviving copies of the collection of canon law texts drawn up by Lanfranc, the first Archbishop of Canterbury to be appointed following the conquest, and has been at the cathedral ever since it was made. Its presence surely indicates that the Hereford canons, led by Bishop Robert the Lotharingian, who had been consecrated by Archbishop Lanfranc at Canterbury in 1079, were taking the church reforms on board. In the 12th century, the library really began to develop in parallel with the building of the cathedral, and against a cultural background of improvements in education, learning, science and the arts that is sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance. At this time, Hereford was fortunate to have a series of highly educated bishops, some with strong links to centres of learning on the continent, and the canons were a well-educated bunch too. Today, there are 104 books in the Chained Library which date from the 12th century, which makes it a really special collection. Of these, between 40 and 50 have been at the cathedral since the 12th century. This is a significant number. Today, very few 12th century books are still in the places for which they were made. 37 of these books look as though they were made locally. Some of these are in their original bindings, which makes them very special indeed. This is one of them, bound in pale, alum-toured skin over boards made of oak. This style of binding has round tabs at the ends of the spines, and the title has been written on the spine. Inside is a rare place marker made of circles of parchment stitched together and made to slide up and down a thin strip of tawed leather. Was there some sort of scriptorium at Hereford, despite the fact that there was only a small number of residentiary canons? Or were the books made by visiting scribes and binders? We simply do not know. The library developed as a practical reference library for the canons, the books the cathedral clergy needed to prepare sermons and for legal business. In 1198, Ralph Folliot, Archdeacon of Hereford, made the first significant bequest to the library of 20 books, and this is one of them. It contains the text of the Old Testament book of Leviticus, with the accompanying gloss or commentary, written both around and in between the lines of the main text. The beginning of the biblical text is marked with a big and fine illuminated initial. With the addition of Ralph Folliot's books, by the end of the 12th century, Hereford Cathedral had a very good working library that stands comparison in size and scope with those in many other English cathedrals, and which formed a broad and solid basis for development over the next 800 years. At first, the books might have been stored in book chests, such as this one, dating from the 14th century. If not in chests, books could be kept in cupboards or armaria. In the 15th century, there was a library room over the west walk of the cloister, and here the books may have been stored chained to lecterns, with their front covers uppermost. The library continued to grow gradually during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, largely through a series of important gifts and bequests. In 1476, Richard Rudhale, Archdeacon of Hereford, died and left the cathedral a collection of law books, including ones from Italy, where he had studied. 2 years later, in 1478, Canon Owen Lloyd died and left at least 30 books, of which 25 have survived. This lavishly decorated manuscript of Gratian's Decretum is thought to have originally belonged to the bibliophile John Grandison, Bishop of Exeter. Sir John Price, who died in 1555, an administrator and bibliophile, left at least 37 books, many acquired from dissolved monastic foundations, including Cirencester Abbey, St Peter's Abbey, Gloucester, and St Guthlac's Priory in Hereford. This one is a very early printed book, the Cosmographia of the 2nd century Claudius Ptolemy, with hand-coloured maps of how the world was recorded by the Romans. It was published in Venice in 1486. In 1583, a commission was appointed by Queen Elizabeth I to inquire into the state of the cathedral. All was not well. The new statutes that came into force as a result show that the library had been neglected and it was fallen into disrepair. The statutes laid down that one of the residentiary canons should be appointed as master of the library. Today, the cathedral chancellor holds that position, and that all the books should be chained. At that time, books were still extremely expensive, and an average person would not be able to afford them. In 1590, the library was moved into the Lady Chapel. New books were bought, and they were chained. The master of the library at the time was Thomas Thornton, the precentor. He was also master of St Catherine's Hospital, Ledbury, and this is his memorial in Ledbury Parish Church. Thornton was also a canon of Christ Church, Oxford, and was well aware of the new library installed by Sir Thomas Bodley at Duke Humphrey's Library in the late 1590s, and of similar libraries in Oxford colleges. This was the latest style, which allowed many more books to be packed into a smaller space, on upright shelves, but also kept them chained for security. Thornton was determined that Hereford should have a library every bit as fine as the ones at Oxford, and records surviving in the cathedral archives show how he accomplished this. Here, in October 1611, is the first indication of work being carried out. A local carpenter, Richard Rogers, is instructed to make one double bookcase or desk for each side of the library, using
good and well-seasoned oak, the best that may be gotten,
and told that the work should be
well and cleanly ironed and wrought, equal for substance, proportion, and workmanship to the desks and seats in the public library of the University of Oxford.
A double bookcase is one in which the books are shelved on both sides, back to back. The furnishings for the complete chained library, which has 6 double bookcases and 2 single, were not all produced at once, but in several stages, over a period of at least 15 years. Although the woodwork could be sourced locally, a blacksmith was sent from Oxford to forge the locks, the hasps and the rods, whereas the chains had to come from Birmingham via Oxford. And this is explained in this letter dated the 20th of January 1612, which describes how the special chains have a squivel or bolt in the midst, which keeps them very much from entangling. And here you can see a book with one of the chains complete with its swivel. At the same time as the library was being constructed, an oath in Latin was drawn up similar to the one sworn by library users at Oxford, and a list of rules was sketched out by Thomas Thornton.
1. Everyone admitted to take the general oath to the church. 2. To swear to further the good of the library and books therein all he can. 3. Not to tear, blot, note, or otherwise hurt or annoy any books thereof. 4. To shut, clasp, or tie and put in his due place every book he shall open, or find opened. 5. Not to lend his key to any but to such a one as he shall know to be admitted or sworn to the library. 6. To lock the door after him when he goeth in or out to study therein, except when he goeth into the same with strangers to show it to them.
The library survived the English Civil War, and later in the 17th century, the number of books was significantly increased when, following the Popish plot of 1678, Bishop Herbert Croft closed down the headquarters of the Jesuit province of St. Francis Xavier at the Cum near Monmouth and seized its library, most of which came to the cathedral. Many of these books are in small format and modestly bound in limp vellum covers. This is one of the Jesuits, Thomas Owen, who not only placed his initials on the title page of his book, but drew a self-portrait. He served the Jesuit college from 1646 to 1649 and gave it 6 books, which we have today. Moving on into the 18th century, in 1745 a Mr. James Rawlinson was employed to make a catalogue of all the books and write out lists for the ends of each press, 14 in all. His catalogue survives, listing the books in shelf order. But by the late 18th century, it would appear that the rules of the library were not being adhered to, particularly the one about putting books back in their due places. For in 1778, a Mr. Michael Reynolds was engaged to prepare another catalogue of the books, and his account includes 5 shillings for the time spent over 3 days.
In examining the state of the library and making such general observations on the irregular and confused disposition of the books as might enable me with the greater accuracy to regulate and adjust their situations.
Although this is evidence for neglect, perhaps it also helps to explain how the library survived so long without having its chains removed. By the 19th century, a library in which all the books were chained was something of an oddity. The bibliophile Beriah Botfield, who visited shortly before the chained library was dismantled, was admiring of the rarity of the books, but alarmed by the chains, remarking that
even the catalogue of the library is riveted to the desk on which it stands, and all additions made to the collection are chained beside their elder brethren. These fetters are very injurious to the binding of the books, and by causing all the volumes to have their four edges turned outwards, are by no means calculated to invite the beholder.
this intriguing pencil drawing is the only image we have of the chained library in situ in the Lady Chapel. It's said to date from about 1841, shortly before the library was dismantled, driven by the need to repair the East End, which was in danger of collapse. If you visited the cathedral before 1996, then you would have been able to see half the chained library in the muniment room above the north choir aisle. The other half was kept in the library extension, built on the end of the cloisters towards the end of the 19th century, known as the Dean Lee Library, after the dean at the time. In the 20th century, one of the canons, Bernard Hillman Streeter, was intrigued by the chained library, researched its history, and set about restoring it to its original arrangement. But it was not until 1996, when the new library building was opened by the Queen, that for the first time since 1841, the whole of the chained library could be seen by the public in the same place. Today, continuing the 800-year tradition of the cathedral being a centre of learning, scholars come from all over the world to study our historic books, manuscripts and documents in a purpose-built reading room above the chained library. We are one of only a small number of cathedrals which can offer access to their historic libraries and archives with supporting modern materials all together in one place. We continue to try to acquire new books, the best that may be gotten, in modern scholarship, theological thinking, and inspirational writing. The Chained Library can be seen by the public today as part of an exhibition which includes the Hereford Mappa Mundi and changing displays of other treasures from the cathedral's collections.
You can learn more about the story of Hereford Cathedral at www.herefordcathedral.org and watch our fascinating films about its most famous treasure, the Mappa Mundi, at www.historywm.com.